So we're starting, Arjun?
Yes. Okay. Namaste and good evening, everyone. On behalf of IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, welcome you to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered here for a special lecture on Budget 2021 and Economic Reforms 2.0 towards New India #Atmanirbhar Bharat. Our speaker for today is Dr. Dheeraj Nair. I would now like to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is Director at IMPRI and China India Visiting Fellow at Ashoka University. Sir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Ritika. So we have this very pertinent discussion today and a special lecture by Dheeraj Nair sir, who will speak today on Budget 2021 Economic Reforms 2.0 towards New India, #Atmanirbhar Bharat. Let me just briefly introduce Dheeraj sir. Dheeraj sir is a trained economist with a unique career trajectory, having held senior positions in the media, government, and also corporate sector. Sir is currently Director of Economics and Policy at Vedanta Resources Limited after serving as Chief Economist for the same. He has also worked as Officer on Special Duty and Head of Economics, Finance and International Trade in Niti Aayog recently for about 3 years. And he has been associated with media houses such as Bloomberg, Quint, and his latest book released in 2018 and is titled Modi and Markets, Arguments for Transformation. We are also delighted to have Professor Atul Sharma also with us, chairing this deliberation, who is currently a visiting professor at Institute for Studies in Industrial Development, New Delhi, and also Council for Social Development, Institute for Human Development, many places Sir is associated with. Sir was also previously Vice Chancellor at Rajiv Gandhi University, Itanagar, and Sir was also member of 13th Finance Commission and also chairman of OKD Institute of Social Change and Development, Guwahati. And Sir was also previously Professor of Economics and head at ISI, Delhi. And Sir's CV is very big. So today's Dheeraj sir is the day. So without wasting any time, Atul sir, your welcome remarks and to invite Dheeraj sir for his lecture.
Thank you, Arjun. It's really great pleasure for me to chair this session where Dheeraj will make a presentation on budget. The budget 21-22 was presented in a very difficult, in the dropback of a very difficult situation. The three major challenges it faced: one is the pandemic containment. The pandemic is COVID-19 is still not over. It has to be contained. Number two is the massive job loss after when lockdown was imposed to contain COVID-19. And third is the income loss. So the challenges are to create jobs, recover to economic recovery, and put the economy again on the path of high growth trajectory. So in this context, the budget is presented. It seems I don't want to discuss much. I'd like to listen to Dheeraj. I think in the context of these difficult situations, the budget has been presented. And the trust is, of course, on economic reforms, which Dheeraj is going to like. So I welcome Dheeraj. You take over. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sharma, and thank you, Arjun. I thank the Institute for inviting me to speak on the budget and New India. So I think I'll start with what Professor Sharma said, that the one context in this budget was that it was presented in a unique backdrop. I mean, the sharpest slowdown since we've had independence, really. I mean, a 7 to 8% contraction for the year. In fact, I never thought I would see a quarterly number of minus 23.9 for India. I didn't really expect even -7 or -8. So what we've lost is significant, and we also have to realize, therefore, that it'll take about a year more to just catch up and be back at the position we were pre-COVID. So in many ways, it's 2 lost years. But as I will explain as I go along, that the one way to view things is to view them as lost or negative. I think it's also an opportunity, and I'll therefore the budget in one background. I mean, the one background is of course this extremely challenging situation, but challenging situations also give you a canvas of opportunity. I think the second context, which I want to emphasize before I start commenting on the budget, was what was happening before COVID, because there was something going on in the economy in terms of a slowdown for several quarters, even before COVID. And in fact, it had come down all the way from 8+ to about 4 before COVID. And I think there are, again, two fundamental reasons, in my view, that growth was falling or growth was stagnating at a sort of mediocre 4-5 level, because I think India should grow at nothing less than 8, preferably in double digits. And that was the stagnation in investment, private investment in particular. And that's been going on actually since 2011-12. So it's been almost 10 years now. But if you even look at the period before COVID, for 8 or 9 years, private investment as a share of GDP was not really budging much beyond 28, 29. And the context again is that in India, when we grew at 9 or 10% between 2003 and 8, which was our fastest period of growth in history, investment as a percentage of GDP, private investment was about 36. So we are about 7. We are and have been about 7% short of that mark. Since then, since 2011. In fact, it's been stuck at under 30. And again, just for a comparison, in China and in East Asia, all countries which have grown in double digits, this percentage tends to be 40 or 40 plus. China still maintains 40 plus. And therefore, I think fundamentally with the 29% investment to GDP ratio, I don't think that's enough to sustain 8 to 10% growth. The other engine of growth, I mean, is exports. And we know that. And I think, again, if you look at exports, the pre-COVID 4 to 5 years have been a story really of them being at the same level, perhaps even going down and then recovering to the same level as they were in 2013-14. So we've not seen any significant export growth. Now, one argument could be that global trade slowed down during this period, which is true. And it was not growing the way it did in 2003 to 8 when our exports also boomed. At the same time, one must recognize that India's share of global trade is still pretty low. A merchandise trade is only about 1.7%, whereas China is 14, the US would be 13, EU somewhere in that region. So I think India, even if global trade is slowing down overall, if we were competitive enough, we could still take a larger share of that pie and grow our exports. So I think that, again, the fact that we've not been able to raise exports shows certain fundamental weakness in the economy, particularly in manufacturing. So I think the budget therefore had to, in many ways, address both these challenges. One was the immediate shock posed by COVID, which is of course unprecedented. But the second was to use it as an opportunity to get India back onto some kind of higher growth trajectory and a more sustainable growth trajectory. Because I think, again, if India is to become a higher middle income country, we need to grow at 8 to 10% for 20 years at least. We can't have spurts of 4 or 5 years and then go back down. So I think that really is the context. So I would set the twin context of the COVID crisis and the slowdown led by investment and exports. And I think, again, before I come to the budget, again, we must realize that when we talk about stimulus, and I will comment on that, the share of government in GDP. So if you look at GDP as an equation of consumption, investment, government spending, plus exports minus imports, government spending is actually the smallest component. It's about 14-15% of GDP at most. So it is clearly exports, investment, as I said, almost 30, exports over 20, consumption 60, but consumption is derived from investment and exports. It doesn't come out of nowhere. But therefore, to understand also that the government size will be limited and has been getting more limited in India in the 30 years after economic reform, and we must be realistic about how much the government can do to lift the entire. There's a lot it can do and did do during the COVID period, but over the medium term going forward from here, this government's role, I believe, is more in terms of the enabling framework, both macroeconomic and structural, and less so in terms of actually raising the GDP. So let me comment on the budget now, coming from away from the context. The first thing I think one can comment on is the sort of fiscal macro part of it, because I think that was really the most important given the immediate backdrop of COVID and the sharp fall in growth. Now, I think the one thing I noted from this budget is that the government finally seems to have abandoned its fiscal conservatism. So my observation during the peak period of COVID and the first 6 months post-COVID, say in April to September last year, the government was relied largely on monetary measures, liquidity measures to support the economy and vulnerable sections. It was more limited on fiscal stimulus in terms of fiscal outgo. Of course, there was a program to provide cheap food, which was extended, and there was a certain amount of cash transfer early on to the poorer sections. But by and large, if you look at what other countries did in other parts of the world, India's fiscal stimulus was relatively small in terms of outgo. But I think finally, and I think the government's own argument was that when things are locked down, when things are uncertain, it doesn't make sense to give too much stimulus because people will not spend it. But regardless of that, I think they finally seem to have clarified the position that they are in favor of a stimulus now that the economy is recovering, but still needs considerable support to get back, as I said, to where we were before COVID. So, I mean, the thing again is that for me, it's always about speed. We will get back to where we were before COVID. We will get to 5 trillion. We will get to 10 trillion, all those landmarks. But what matters is speed. And I think at this point as well, when there's, as Professor Sarma referred to in his introductory remarks, income loss, job loss, firms going under, I think the need for fiscal support and to be expansionary on the fiscal front is very important. And I'm glad the government with this budget has finally, come out, so to speak, and become fiscally liberal. Overall, if you look at, they've clearly maintained or increased expenditure. In fact, there has been some amount of switch towards capital expenditure. It's, I think, gone up by 30% over last year. But again, the context is very important, because if you look at capital expenditure, the amount committed is about 5 lakh crore, and the total government spending is about 35 lakh crore. So it's still, capital spending still remains a small amount of total government spending, but nonetheless, it's welcome. Any increase in capital spending is welcome, because that's what gives you returns. You can afford a fiscal deficit if it's spent more on capital expenditure rather than on revenue expenditure. So to that extent, I welcome the fact that the government has chosen to focus on capital spending and infrastructure in particular. I think the second accompanying trend, which I was happy with, was that they did not increase taxes. Now, the temptation would have always been to open your purse, but then tap on the taxpayers' purse to finance some of it. Again, I think under the circumstances, because I believe, again, the private sector, investment, consumption, because they are the bigger components of GDP, these have to lead the revival in the medium term. So taxing more at this stage would have been counterproductive to the idea of a stimulus. So I'm glad the government stuck to its, I was not in favor of cutting taxes either. So I'm glad they've stuck to the status quo. And from all accounts, they seem to have suggested that this will now be a kind of stable tax framework. They'll try and tinker less with it and let it be consistent over time. I think you cannot overestimate the importance of that, because I think investment in particular responds a lot to predictability and certainty. And I think if the government tinkers less as it goes forward, it will be better. So I think overall, raising expenditure, not taxing more is good. And I think finally the FRBM, which had set this limit of 3% and glide path to 3%, that has been abandoned, and I'm glad it has been, because I don't think that was an appropriate fiscal framework for India, particularly in the context when private investment is slowing down even before COVID. It's completely probably now in this year, a lot of projects would not even got announced or taken off. So I think given that for the foreseeable future, for the next 4 or 5 years, government is going to have to spend on investment to crowd in the private sector. So I think that traditionally the FRBM view was that the government crowds out the private sector, and therefore its fiscal deficit should be limited to 3%. But I think right now the medium-term circumstances are exactly the opposite. So I'm glad that they've set a very gradual path towards going down to 4.5 only by 2026, FY26, which is 5 years from now. I think it will be hard for them to meet the next year's target of 6.8. It depends heavily on disinvestment, which I'll come to in a bit and explain why it may be hard to achieve. But nonetheless, I'm glad they've abandoned the FRBM straitjacket because I think it was not suitable for growth. I think the accompanying, and this is where I'll make a comment on the macroeconomic framework overall. I think one was this FRBM fiscal conservatism, and on the other side, you have the monetary policy framework, which demands inflation targeting. And I'm not sure, though that was not addressed in the budget, I'm not sure that it's has also done a great job for growth in India, because as you can see, even now when demand is completely depressed, inflation in India as measured by CPI is running at 5-6%, right? And the RBI has to target that, and 6 is at the upper end of their target, and they would be hesitant to cut rates. So I think interest rates in India generally have been too high, even before COVID, for the kind of growth we need. And that's partly because of this inflation targeting framework, which I don't think works well. It's a demand management framework, but in India, inflation is very often caused by supply factors, comes largely from food and fuel. Because if you look at WPI, which doesn't have those components, it's fairly flat. But the target is CPI, not WPI. So therefore, I think put together this fiscal conservatism and monetary policy framework were not giving India the kind of macro framework needed for rapid growth. These were not enabling 8 to 10% growth. So I'm glad the FRBM part, the fiscal part, has been corrected. I hope going forward a more pragmatic view is taken of the monetary policy framework as well, because I think what COVID has exposed is that inflation can be high in India even when demand is terribly depressed. It's got nothing to do with demand, and interest rates are not a good instrument to control food or fuel inflation. So I have a feeling this may be the first step towards correcting the overall macro framework necessary for growth. And I think that's where the budget is important, because budget fundamentally is about the government's fiscal decisions and fiscal framework. So I think we've definitely moved. And when I talk of new India or India in the future, growth is not sufficient, but it's necessary. I mean, without 8 to 10% growth, none of our other goals are going to be achieved in any significant way. I think the second big piece of the budget, in terms of, again, looking at the future and unlocking the growth potential, investment potential, is that there is a certain concrete thinking on the financial sector. Now, we again know that the banking system has been in a mess for several years now, laden with NPAs, and the government standard response in the last few budgets has been to recapitalize public sector banks. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, and many of them needed that recapitalization, but I don't think that was solving the problem of credit flow or solving the problem of NPAs in the banking system. And again, the banking system, financial system, is the heart of the economy. It's like the heart of the body. It's what pumps the blood. It's what, if the blood supply stops, then the body itself is not going to be alive and kicking. So I think it was very necessary to unclog the financial sector. And there is some thinking beyond recapitalization in this. So for example, they're setting up this ARC, asset reconstruction company, or bad bank, or whatever you might call it, which will take over the bad assets of the existing banking system to free the banks from that burden. Now, again, by itself, it could have a lot of moral hazard and other problems. But I think if simultaneously the government is thinking about actually privatizing public sector banks, they've said they're going to do 2 in this coming financial year. That's a big step, because I think that's what will improve governance and the lending methods. But so I think privatization, the ARC, AMC, and I think the third problem, the fundamental problem that got the banking system into this mess was that banks were being used to fund infrastructure. And I don't think that's fundamentally a sound principle, because banks basically, the borrowings they have as in deposits are short term, and infrastructure lending is long term. So I think the idea to set up therefore this development finance institution with an equity of 20,000 crores, and it will lend 1 lakh crore a year for 5 years on infra projects, is again a way to relieve the banking system of unnecessary stress of infrastructure financing, which is highly risky and long term. And I think the banking system is not well equipped to deal with it. So I think overall, again, on the financing side, as I said, the ARC, AMC, the privatization idea, the development finance institution, and then on the insurance side, they've allowed FDI, majority FDI in insurance, 74%. So I think all these things put together suggest that there is a more determined effort to not kick the can down the road, but to actually come up with some solution which will free banking from the protracted mess it's been in. And I think that's, again, the only way to move forward and get growth going again in all sectors of the economy. Because, it's easy for foreign big firms or FDI to raise money abroad, But for our SMEs and for our individuals and for our new entrepreneurs, it's the Indian financial system which gives them the money. They don't have access to the international market. So I think that's very important. That said, I don't think this is the complete job. Regulation, improving regulation is going to be an equally important part, which is not necessarily budget, which comes under the RBI's remit. But I think regulation also needs to step up if the banking system is to function well in the future. But nonetheless, that's so after fiscal, I think a focus on the financial system and the problems there has been good. The third thing I'd like to talk about is the intent to privatize, and I'm glad the finance minister used privatization as a term rather than hiding it under disinvestment or strategic disinvestment. And I think again, this government has been saying for long, government has no business to be in business. Now they intend to sell all the PSUs except a handful in strategic sectors. My view, of course, is there is no such thing as strategic sector. Because if you look at the most strategic sector, which is defense, India has to import most of its 90% of its requirements because the PSUs which dominate the sector, which have monopolies in the sector, don't really produce quality goods or cheap enough products. So we're buying from everywhere else in the world. So what use is a strategic PSU if it can't meet your defense needs, if it can't meet your oil needs? We import 85% oil, but we think oil is a strategic sector, should have PSU preferences. So I think, anyway, that's besides the point, but at least they've made a clear statement that they're going to do this. Now, of course, a lot depends on execution. And I think one of the mistakes the government makes with disinvestment or privatization is to view it in revenue terms. Because I don't think it's about revenue. I mean, yes, that's the side benefit that the government can earn some revenue, but I think it's really about efficiency. And until that narrative is changed, I think execution will be very difficult because everybody will have an eye on how much a particular company is sold for, how much a particular land asset is sold for, how much a thing is sold for, and then that's where all the controversy comes in. So I think they need to follow up by changing the narrative from revenue to efficiency. They need to prioritize the lower hanging fruit first. To privatize Air India first is putting the toughest question in the exam first, and the toughest will obviously hold you up from some of the easier stuff. So maybe a few listed companies which have transparent stock market prices, they should go ahead with those first. And again, the second narrative change that's needed, apart from the one I mentioned, is that people view privatization as the sale of a government asset to a promoter-owned organization, the familiar Ambani, Adani, Vedanta, whatever you want to, whichever businessman's name you want to take. But I think the alternate way is that you don't sell it, especially with listed companies, you don't sell it to a individual or to a promoter, but you dilute the government shares to below 50%, 49. The moment it comes below 50, the company ceases to be a PSC. It's not going to be monitored by CAG, CVC, all of these people. It'll have an independent board, professional management, it can pay proper salaries. So I think, again, the narrative change needs to be that we are not necessarily selling these assets to any big business. We are putting the shares in widely held by the Indian public. And that should be really the model of disinvestment. I think India's capitalism also needs more of that. It needs more firms which are widely held by the public, like L&T is, for example. And in the US and in more mature economies, a lot of firms are very widely held, not by any one family or something. So I think we could, through disinvestment, set up an entire set of firms which could be like L&T, widely held by the public and not by anybody, but which are very professionally managed and can unlock a lot of efficiency and value. But I think this will be core. I think this is really, if they can pull this off, there are 250 odd active PSUs. If they can actually offload a significant number in the next 2 or 3 years, I think this will really, in terms of efficiency, in terms of creating world-class companies, give a real boost to India. This could be the legacy reform, as far as I can see, for this government. But if they want to do it, they're going to have to give bureaucrats confidence that it's not only about revenue, it's not about the right value, it's about something bigger than that. It's about bringing a much bigger, change to the economy. The fifth aspect I like to talk about is manufacturing. So I think, again, if you talk about New India, apart from privatization, we do need a robust manufacturing sector. Now, we didn't create an efficient manufacturing sector before 91 when we had this extreme protection and no competition. We didn't create a competitive manufacturing in the 30 years after 91 when we had a lot of tariff liberalization. So I think by itself, tariff liberalization or trade liberalization has not either created, with either high tariffs or low tariffs, you don't necessarily create competitive manufacturing. You need many other reforms. I think to that extent, I view that decision to raise tariffs in certain areas less pessimistically than some other people, because now I do work for industry, and I see that industry does have a lot of inherent structural disadvantages because of uncompetitive labor markets, uncompetitive land markets, uncompetitive capital markets. Power tariffs are too high, logistics costs are too high. So for all of these things, especially if you're competing with China and Vietnam, you cannot do it without some limited protection. But that limited protection must be accompanied by other reform, and the government has moved forward on labor, for example, and now they are trying to clean up capital. So they are doing that, but I think some breathing space for manufacturing is necessary. So to that extent, I compliment them for this. Also, I'm happy to see, which was announced before the budget, that they moved to a incentive in the form of production linked incentives, which are performance linked incentives. So that gives firms less option to be lazy. You have to perform to a certain amount to get those incentives. And of course, I don't think it's all one way. I mean, there are a lot of people who think that this tariff raising is one way. I mean, steel, which is a very major manufacturing sector, actually saw its tariff cut down from 12.5 to 7.5 this time. And they also got rid of CVDs and anti-dumping duties. So it's not that it's one-way traffic. They're quite willing to cut the tariff if they think the sector is misusing or taking unfair advantage of the protection it's being given. So I think it's a judicious, I mean, it's a difficult path to tread because there are risks with protection. But on the other hand, as I said, complete trade liberalization hasn't got us a good manufacturing sector either. And if you have to talk about generating jobs post-COVID, if 40% of the workforce is in agriculture, producing 13% of GDP, some of them need to go into manufacturing. Agriculture cannot support so many people. So I think if you're going to talk about jobs, except manufacturing, I don't think you're going to get those kind of quality jobs that we're looking for, for our population. So I think this was a good point again, good time to focus on manufacturing because the world is looking to diversify away from China. They want alternate supply chains, and India as a large economy is certainly one potential place where investors, can go from if they are exiting China or if they're choosing other destinations. So I think to that extent, I don't think the protection is overdone. This was the first budget which was after the call for Atmanirbhar Bharat. So I mean, one could have expected if it was the old style protectionism, they would go across the board and raise tariffs to 20-30%. The increases which are there are fairly nominal, well below India's bound rate at WTO. And I think at the same time, they've shown willingness to reduce also in certain sectors. And don't also forget that we do have FTAs with some very strong manufacturing countries like the ASEAN region and in Japan, South Korea. So I don't think this protection, that's the point I wanted to make, that this is a strategic thrust towards manufacturing, which must be given a chance and not be viewed negatively. So I would also say this is something which has been viewed negatively by a lot of people with respect to this government and its policies, including this budget. But I don't think it's necessarily negative. I think it's giving manufacturing that last chance, and it's giving jobs a chance, because I think without manufacturing, there will not be enough jobs for the kind of population we have or the kind of people coming into the labor force every year. And the last point I'll make, and I'll stop after that, is that there is at the same time, which is again very typical of those who followed Modi's government, whether part one or part two, there continues to be an interesting emphasis on certain welfare activities. So I think in the first term it was very much focused on direct benefit transfer of pensions, scholarships, and it was focused on delivery of gas cylinders or homes, those kind of things, toilets. That was very much the focus of the first term. Now, in this term, I clearly see from, again, this budget, the kind of allocation rise they've given to water, to the Jal Jeevan mission. So I think the one priority they clearly have, 5-time increase from, I think, 10,000 crores to 50,000 crores, is that their real push in this term in terms of the social side is going to be towards this mission, which is to provide tap drinking water to every household. And I think that, again, emphasizes the point that while we can have these market reforms on the one side, and which are very important for efficiency and growth, there remain certain other parts of the economy which will not be served by market forces and which need efficient government responses. So in India, we get plenty of government response, but it's not always efficient or focused. But I think at least now this focus on water, for example, is a good new focus because I think, again, it will have very positive outcomes for the population. And I think the second important thing is on health. Again, the context obviously necessitated it, and there's an allocation for vaccines, which is one time, and there's certain water and sanitation programs which have also been clubbed into the health category. But overall, I think the focus on health and water, which I suspect is going to be the main focus on the social side of the second Modi term, will be very, very important, because these are two sectors again where we've lagged well behind. And what better time than a pandemic to wake us up to the need to boost our health infrastructure, particularly in the smaller cities and rural areas and so on, and to focus also on prevention and public health, not so much on tertiary care, because again, as the old medical saying goes, prevention is better than cure. So I'm again happy that there's a focus on health and water. I think just the one thing that I would have expected, I was hoping for the budget, which didn't come, is some kind of cash transfer program for the poorest. I think that kind of income support, direct income support, would have helped them in this difficult time, and it would have given a boost to consumption, because the marginal propensity to consume of those segments is the highest. So I think it could have been a good measure. You could have you have the mechanisms now. I mean, earlier 10 years ago, I wouldn't recommend this kind of thing, because you didn't have any mechanism. But now that you have the Jan Dhan accounts, you have Aadhaar, you have mobile phones, there was an efficient there is an efficient infrastructure to do this kind of cash transfer, when required. And I think it could have been done both as a welfare measure and as a growth enhancing measure, because it's the particular context. I'm again not normally in favor of doles or freebies, but I think this is an extraordinary time we are going through, and therefore it could have been done, but it was not. From all accounts, the government is betting on growth more than redistribution, and in many ways that itself is a welcome change for me. Though I wish this had happened, but I think a government which is looking more medium term, which is looking at creating the macroeconomic framework for growth, the structural framework for growth. I think that's a good thing, because in India, very often I say that we are a slice of cake political economy, not a size of cake. Nobody really cares about the size of the cake. Everybody, including the middle class, wants their tax break, wants this benefit, that benefit. Everybody wants that, and nobody really thinks about growing that size, because once that size grows, we all can get a bigger piece. But let that size grow first. We are still only 2.7 trillion. Our per capita income is only 2,000. So we are nowhere near that level of income where we can fight for significant slices. So in that sense, a lot of middle class also complained that they could have got a tax break. But I think the middle class should be much more invested in medium-term growth, because that is what will create opportunities. That's what will create more income than a 5% or 2% tax break at this particular point in time. So in that sense, again, the fact that this budget, and perhaps this was the last opportunity for this government to be totally growth focused in terms of a budget, because next year the budget will come before the very important Uttar Pradesh elections, and in 2023 it will be the pre-2024 general election budget. So this was a unique opportunity politically, economically, because of the crisis. And I think while no budget can address all the problems of the Indian economy, the fundamental of which, as I said earlier, is that we are not a competitive economy vis-a-vis others. But they have tried. They seem to have a plan, and they've rolled out that plan. And hopefully, in the months to come, the bet on growth will pay off, and we'll come back to our pre-COVID position, hopefully before the end of the next financial year. And then from there on, we need to seriously look at getting back to 7-8% trajectory. If they can do the privatization program, if they can actually clean up the banks, if the execution of these plans is good, then we can achieve a 10% trajectory as well for 5 years down the line. But yeah, overall, I think good budget. As I said, not everything will ever be addressed, and the one miss for me was this direct cash transfer for the neediest. But otherwise, certainly, I think one of the better budgets of recent times, which has given us a lot to talk about, a lot to analyze, and a lot to track. Because I think the follow-up to a lot of these announcements is what will ultimately decide. 10 years from now, we'll look back and say this was a historic budget. If all these things, materialize on the ground, if execution happens, if they don't, then it'll be just one more budget. So I think budget is there, but follow up over the next year on implementation will be equally important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dheeraj sir, for really highlighting and the really good, very exciting thing which you mentioned about the slice of cake and size of the cake. Really, that was a very good example. So without any further ado, Atul sir, would you like to go first and reflect upon some of the things?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to really thank Dheeraj for making a very perceptive presentation of the budget. It's a very good presentation in the sense that it's a very balanced one. But I totally agree with his last point that cash transfer would have been needed because there are two parts. One is the recovery, is the immediate need in view of the 38 million people losing jobs against in December, according to CMI. And there is a demand deficiency in the system. So cash transfers to an extent would have made the demand deficiency and helped in recovery. I totally agree with this point. But I'd like to ask Dheeraj a couple of my own reservations. One is that, always it is said in 12 plan document, there's a chapter which was written by Montague himself, perhaps, raising this question that everybody said that we have got excellent plan, but implementation is poor. And that is this is the problem which we have been facing for all these years. Now, how do we expect? There are many good things which depend, its success greatly depend on the pace of implementation and efficient implementation. But what is there in this to believe or to be confident that implementation will faster here? Because the entire job creation or income creation problem is a medium-term program. 5.5 lakh crore on capital expenditure, which should give rise to, which should contribute to growth. But it's a medium term. It will take 2-3 years. But infrastructure to implement, even the land acquisition takes 2-3 years, and that is our experience. And given that, how do series be confident that all this implementation could be done within a period of a year, and the expected recovery will be possible through this strategy? That's one point. And second is I see some kind of contradiction. For us, is our export, as you have rightly said, that export share of our global export is very low. So, but export is extremely important. But what is that? Is there no contradiction that in the following thing, we need the global value chain to increase the export growth? On the other hand, we're introducing some import duties. We have moved to protectionism. Does it not contradict in the framework? This is my second point to get clarification from you. And third is privatization. Again, the question of implementation. The privatization, we have seen the Air India. For a number of years, we have been talking about privatizing Air India, but it has still not taken off. But how do we expect to privatize? There'll be a lot of issues. And how do we expect to privatize and reach 1.75 lakh crore or something from privatization? First last year it was from something like 2.5 crore or 5 lakh crore was targeted. But because of COVID-19 situation partly, that only realization was 15,000 crore. So our past records in terms of privatization Privatization, by the way, has been used for the first time. Earlier, they were talking about disinvestment, but it's a good thing to be clear that they're going for privatization. But what is the clear strategy to privatize at a fast pace? That's not clear to me. And finally, I would like to ask you one more thing, that if we were to really speed up the growth within a year, do it in pre-COVID situation, that is also not very high, then do you expect to be able to achieve what is the time frame in which you expect that we would be able to reach the COVID-19 situation? I stop with this, and then after discussion, maybe I may have to say a couple of things more, but I'd like to get this clarification from you.
Thank you. Dheeraj sir, would you like to?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, I mean, implementation is always key. And I think, again, I think to the extent that, I mean, we never thought, for example, that, government can ever implement social sector schemes or welfare schemes well, but then, technology helps. And, you got this platform of Aadhaar, the fact that, the mobile phone coverage reaches so wide. Now you have data, which is amongst the cheapest in the world. So I think we have the technology and certain platforms which are available for implementation, as I said, of certain kinds of things. And to the extent that the government deploys more technology across the board in terms of monitoring, in terms of processes, moving a little more, for example, towards self-certification, because otherwise, a lot of the capital spending on projects and so on, it gets stuck in, clearances and approvals and so on. So I think there are ways in which this can be done, especially speed, I think, which can be done. So I think that is one way. And second, I think, again, it's an old argument, but to the extent you can decentralize some of your key implementation decisions, the better it is. Because I think, again, if everything is attempted from Delhi, then they will get into the same problems as we always used to have. So I think Delhi, to some extent, can finance certain things, but I think implementation there needs to be a greater flexibility and greater proximity to the ground. And I think, where possible, again, I think the state has limited capacity. We know that in India. So where possible, particularly in large projects, I think there's certainly private sector capacity can be leveraged, to improve implementation. So even if the government is overall running the program, there are institutions you can set up or structures you can set up where you can leverage, the efficiency or the management skills of the private sector. I mean, like Aadhaar, for example, I think the only reason it got done was because you had Nandan Nilekani heading it, and he knew how to run a project, and he executed it that way. So to that extent, I think we could also look for leveraging those expertise. But of course, none of these are foolproof. But I think there's certainly options available, and this government, to be fair to it, does do a fairly thorough job of monitoring and reviewing and so on big projects. But some of those, as you said, as you well know, all of you, that those inherent problems are there. So even if the direction comes from the highest level, it takes some time to get the implementation off the ground. So I think that would be my point on implementation overall. I think on disinvestment, again, I think it's a strategy which makes all the difference. And I think the last privatization as such happened about 20 years ago during the Vajpayee government. So I think there's been no experience. The current bureaucrats, who are probably secretaries or even joint secretaries, have no real previous experience having done it. And then, of course, there's all the baggage and controversy that came along with the process last time. But again, I think compared to 20 years ago, when you put up firms for disinvestment, India's economy was not so big. There were relatively few buyers. We had not moved to transparent auction mechanisms. So I think, again, the advance in both theory and practice, in terms of auction design, in terms of the number of people who would be interested, both domestic and foreign, I think would lend to a much smoother process this time. But if you put the toughest and most intractable problem first, which is something like Air India, which because of legacy and debt and other issues would in any case find fewer buyers, I think I would reverse the process and try and put up 3-4 firms which are listed. As I said, those will be transparent market prices, which are listed, profitable, relatively well functioning. I think if you can get those off the block, then it will give confidence to the system to do the tougher ones. But if you try the toughest one first, then I think the confidence doesn't get into the system, because there's an entire chain which needs to take these decisions. So I think to that extent, a rethink on the implementation strategy, like the way they've tried to do it so far, hasn't got the process quite off the ground. So I think on privatization, I would say that. I said, what were your other two questions?
The contradiction between.
Yes, yes. So I think you're right. So I'm not a great fan of protectionism and raising tariffs for any length of time, because I think that's not going to get us anywhere. Yet I think that fundamentally, even the problem with what one has seen with what happened after the India ASEAN FTA or Japan or Korea FTA is that we get the imports have grown much faster than the exports, and a lot of our manufacturing just cannot compete. So I think because we are got our legs tied on, as I said, land is more expensive, labor is not available, everything is, we are a very high cost economy. So I think while we address those things, and I think frankly, if we have to address them, we need to do it in 2 or 3 years, 2, 3, 4 years. If we don't do it, we'll never do it. But if we can address those, at least some of those, then I think we have a better chance of even getting into global value chains. Otherwise, I think we're simply not good enough to even participate in those value chains. And I think the second overall thing which we need to get over to get into value chains is that in India, we romanticize small a lot. So, even our MSMEs, which is micro, small and medium, 90% are micro. We don't even have very many small and medium. And to actually participate productively and efficiently in even regional supply chains or global supply chains, you need certain scale. So I think we need to get out of the romanticization of small. To some extent, the definition changes have helped. But I think otherwise, we always give concessions to the small. We always are patronizing to the small or micro. We need to encourage our firms to get bigger. Micro should become small, small should become medium, medium should become large. I think until that happens again, but again, I think there are various policy disincentives and the competitiveness of the environment is just not there. But I think those will be equally important. So I think tariffs, I would agree with you that they cannot be more than a short-term measure. If you continue them for any length of time or continue to raise them, it will not solve your problem in any way. So you could say there's a contradiction, but I think at the moment my view is that even with FTAs we have not been able to, because ASEAN one I've studied and we've been in it for about 10 years and we haven't really made any headway in getting into any of the supply chains of the region also. So clearly there's something else which is going on, which will not be solved by tariffs alone. Tariffs will give you breathing space, but it will not give you the other things.
My other query was that what is the short-term strategy in a year to address the issue of demand efficiency in the system?
So I think now the strategy clearly seems to be that COVID is on its last legs in India, and we have been fortunate that our opening up of the economy did not coincide with a very large increase in cases like in the US or Europe, which have had to go back into lockdowns. But so I think they've kind of banked on the fact that once these vaccines and so on roll out more in the next 2-3 months, we are over this problem. In fact, in many ways, they believe we are already over the worst of it. But the risk here is that in case some variant or some mutation, anything happens which prolongs this COVID uncertainty, then you will have a problem. So I still think, as I said when I spoke, that I would have still preferred, given the uncertainty which is likely to remain for at least 3-4 more months until we are sure about the vaccines and the mutations and so on, I would have done the cash transfer just to buoy up and shore up demand. So I don't think they have done that. They are basically, and capital expenditure, again, you may increase it right now, but it's going to take a while for it to roll out and impact. It's not
Exactly.
immediate
That is
impact,
the
right?
issue. That's true.
So I think the immediate impact would have only come from some kind of either tax relief to the middle class, but I'm not sure that would have worked. I think the only thing which would have worked was some kind of cash transfer to the, because, otherwise I still think till this 3-4 month period is over, firms are not going to invest. People are going to still be cautious because you still don't know for sure, what may happen with this pandemic. So I think, yeah, that's the only missing piece of the puzzle. But I mean, if we are lucky and the vaccinations work and the mutations don't come, then I suspect that, by the end of this calendar year, we may be pretty close to getting back to where we were before COVID. But I think that's when, for me, that's really when the real challenge begins, because, once you're back and COVID is no longer the factor, then, the rest of the stuff has to come through and the rest of the reform has to kick in. I still think we need, this can't be the end of all reform. I'm also very interested to see, it's not a budget thing, I didn't mention it, therefore, where this farm bills thing goes, because it will test. It will mean a lot for agriculture if some of these things do happen, but B, if they don't happen, and there is a pushback, what it means for pushing ahead with other reforms is also uncertain. Because if this gets pushed back, then privatization could also get pushed back, or some of the other things could also get pushed back. So I think there are still there are a large number of uncertainties. So I agree with. Therefore, I would say that the government really hasn't thought of a deliberate short-term strategy to boost growth back, which is fine as long as everything works well. But if anything goes wrong, then I think we will definitely need another mini budget.
But recovery is the immediate issue, no? Recovery of the economy
Yes.
is an immediate issue.
I agree. So I think right now they're banking on
Medium term.
And this COVID not playing a major role. But I have a feeling that we're still 2-3 months away from even knowing about that.
Let me also just to put into the deliberation. Professor Santosh Mehrotra is also highlighting, Arun, so many economists also, that's this cash transfer now, there is also a shift from Narega. Now everyone wants this cash transfer. The model which we have, the PM Kisan one, 6,000 rupees per annum, which we are sending. We are already sending to around 10 crore households, farm households. And there is this case that it should be given to a non-farmer poor household in rural and urban areas. So let us say, even if we increase from 10 crore beneficiaries to 15 crore beneficiaries, as a financial outlay, it would cost around 30,000 crore more. So would it be adequate? That was also one of my questions, that do we think that 6,000 is the kind of amount, or 30,000, as this can really crowd in? Would it be enough? Because in US or Brazil, Bolsa Familia, they are giving their amount very much, $1,200 to $1,600. So this debate which we have, and also since Dheeraj sir also just also mentioned that there is also now dynamic budgeting. Atmanirbhar 3 packages we saw, and our finance minister is also saying that if this is exhausted, we will add more. So do we think that we really need to have a more a sort of universal cash transfer, and if the outlay would have been only 30,000 crore, will it make such a difference, and our budget would be really nice? Dheeraj sir, your point of view.
I think if they really wanted to be bold, personally, again, earlier on in the crisis, I was in favor of this, that they should not worry so much about a deficit and you can just print money, because this is, it's not a textbook solution, and it's not for normal times. I would never recommend it. But when you have a once in 100-year event which is causing so much shock and so much income loss and so much uncertainty, it's worth doing the cash transfer even with a printing of money, because beyond a point you don't want to borrow, because then you'll completely crowd out any private or consumption-led borrowing for investment or consumption. So I think you don't want to take over all the space, but the government did have the option to monetize a part of it. And I think the economic survey, in fact, did bat for it, for this principle. So I think if required, they can certainly do that. But again, this government has tended to be a little more conservative, because other countries, that's what they're doing. Essentially, the US is printing money, right? So I think that's one approach. But I think right now, given that things have turned around a little and are looking more positive, they are banking. Whatever my view is different, but they are basically banking on now private consumption and private enterprise reviving the economy rather than the government doing the heavy lifting. Government, if it had to do the heavy lifting, then it would have had to do some amount of monetization of debt, of deficit, and cash transfers. But clearly, they believe that that's not required. But as you said, it's a dynamic situation. So if things change for the worse or things don't pick up in the next 3 or 4 months, I wouldn't be surprised if something more comes, because that's just the way the situation is.
Yes, in fact, Dr. Amit Basole from APU, Azim Premji University, his estimate was 54,000 crores. So, and I don't see that these amounts to be so very huge that our leadership cannot do it.
No, I think even if you wanted to do 80,000, 1 lakh crore, you can do it. I don't think it's not a question of affordability. I think it's just a question of what kind of strategy you're banking on to revive growth. And I think for now they've chosen a slightly longer outlook and banking on the private consumption and investment to revive rather than government putting more money. And I think they're also politically, I mean, this government has tended less towards in fact, for next year, even if you look at the NREGAS allocation, it's been cut compared to this year. I mean, it's almost back to the pre. So I don't think they generally favor such handouts or such programs. So I think that's part of that philosophy. But as I said, if things don't seem to be pulling up quickly enough, I have no doubt they'll do it. I mean, it's not I mean, when you can debate is 30,000, 50,000, 70,000, I think they can do whatever they want. But it's a matter of, it's not the money, it's the principle of it. Whether they believe that is the key to recovery.
Right. So let me also, on a macro part, just quickly to add, you have also written also that now our accounts, really what the budget is showing is getting more cleaned up. And so many credit rating agency and others also see. Despite that, we do point out many such kind of things. But in international comparison, when we compare ourselves to China or other economies also, our credibility is quite high in terms of data, because China just fudges it like anything. So what do you think that this budget, given this statement and so many FCI and other issues also coming, would lead to more of predictability and credibility in terms of our accounts overall? The macro.
I think it's one of the highlights of the budget that they've got the food subsidy bill onto the budget and away from this FCI borrowing from the National Small Saving Fund. And frankly, I'm not sure that rating agencies and the others who are watching, they know this fudge. It's not like you're some big secret that you managed to hide away. So I think it's good you've used the opportunity of a crisis to do it. And I'm glad you've got, if this is also a signal that you've got over the fear of rating agencies, I think it's excellent. Because, rating agencies is one thing, it may matter. I'm not saying they don't matter. I don't want to be, reckless and say they don't matter for anything. But ultimately, I believe growth matters for investment. If you're looking at what investors are looking at, are they looking at what the rating agencies are saying? Or are they looking at, what growth is happening? And you spoke about China. With all its fudge data and all its non-transparency, the reason investment goes there is because there's growth. Right. So investors will go where they see growth happening, where they see the market growing bigger. In rating agency may not give you such high marks on transparency or anything, but if you're growing, you'll get it. And similarly, if you're not growing, you keep your fiscal deficit to 3%, the rating agency will give you high marks, but I can tell you no investor will come because nobody comes to a place which is not growing. So I think that fear that, the rating agencies will ABC, if this is the end of that, not that I'm saying this is a license to be fiscally reckless, but this is a license to be fiscally autonomous and flexible given the economic cycle.
Yes, so right. On the point of implementation, just for the continuity, Pankhuri ma'am, I'm just coming back. Yes, because sir mentioned this point. Our finance minister for the first time has now announced for the monetization of our assets from PSU others, a new SPV. as a company which would manage auction and do all the things. How do you see this as an implementation? Because 1.75 lakh crore is the estimated what we have given. And sir, you also mentioned on privatization and disinvestment that if we prioritize and look at low-hanging fruits to leverage out of the situation. So what are your recommendations in terms of the few company names also you took earlier that we should do? Because we are really argumentative Indians, we just get emotional in our things. Yes.
So,
MTNL, Air India.
argument which I keep saying, people say you're selling the family silver. I can tell all of you that it's not silver, it's iron, which is rusting very badly. If you actually, I would have shown you some other time in another occasion. If anybody is interested, look at the stock value of the listed PSUs over the last 10 years. And look at Sensex, Nifty, small cap, large cap, whichever you want to look. All have gone up except PSU index, which has gone steadily down over the last 10 years. A company like BHEL, now I'm talking about what is considered a blue chip company. 10 years ago, its market cap was about the same as L&T. Today, L&T is 4 or 5 times the size of BHEL. So that's the kind of value loss that's happening. If you had sold Air India 20, 25 years ago, you would have got a good price for it. Now, no matter what you do, you will not get a great price. So I think it's a matter of, whether you want to let them all become loss-making and sick and close down, or whether you want to get some value out of it. It's not only that's why I said it's not only about the revenue government is getting. It's about the efficiency. It's about the jobs you'll save. It's about the jobs you'll create. Because a lot of PSUs, people don't know about this, but I mean, when I was in Niti Aayog, I worked on it. There are about 80, 90 which are sick, right? And they are virtually closed. I mean, nobody is getting salary. Nothing is happening because they are sick. So we don't want our PSUs to be in that state. I mean, why can't BHEL or ONGC or your BPCL? These can all be world-class, world-scale companies. So why should we want to keep them in government control and let them run down? Now, in principle, yes, you can say that ownership doesn't matter in Singapore and other places. Government runs companies very well, but we know the Indian reality. We know that it's not run very well. They don't have autonomy. They have to report to the ministries. So I think that's the realistic thing. Now, the problem is, again, you have to accept, and this is again, the success or failure will come down to this. You have to accept that the valuation you get for a government asset, whether it's a PSU or land or piece of land, is what the market decides. It's decided by demand and supply. It cannot be decided by me, you, or a bureaucrat. I cannot tell you that for a listed company, you can still say, but for a piece of land, how am I supposed to tell you what the exact value is? Only it will be determined by demand and supply, right? So you have to accept that. You may not get 10,000 crores for a piece of land, you may get 8,000. But will you not sell it and will you let it lie unproductive because your perception is not being met? So I think that mentality, that mental change has to come. So you can create SPV, you can create whatever you want, but until you're confident about what you're doing and that the market will determine your price, because that's how price is determined. And except in the Soviet system where bureaucrats determine the price is determined by forces of demand and supply. Right? So how can you change that? You can make it more attractive, get foreign bidders, get domestic bidders, open it up to as many buyers as possible, because that's where you'll get the best price. If you have only one bidder or two bidders, you'll naturally get a less price. And that's what I'm saying. If you prioritize some of the better assets, for example, even land, where manufacturing units can set up, or PSUs where there is still value, then you will see the confidence. Otherwise, you won't. If you try and sell Air India, you won't. Right. So I think it should be sold, but that's besides the point. But it's a tough one. It's not easy. I mean, even if I was sitting there, it would be tough. If you were sitting there, it would be tough for you also, for everybody.
Right. And really, sir highlighted, this is the time for India's new companies like L&T. So quickly, let's go to our discussant for this deliberation, Pankhuri Dutt ma'am, who is a public policy consultant at Niti Aayog. Ma'am was also earlier with IMF at Washington, DC. Ma'am, over to you. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. And hi, Dheeraj. Nice to meet you finally virtually. I've heard a lot from the VC team about you. So, and thank you for the great presentation. I agree with every aspect that you brought to the to this discussion. Just a couple of pointers on the capital expenditure. I believe it came at the cost of revenue expenditure, and I would have preferred a slightly more increased total expenditure. because in the short run, I believe RE would lead to more job creations than capital expenditure. But again, agree with you that the budget was more medium term oriented. Um, um, as pointed before in the discussions, I think there were dichotomies in the budget as well, especially in the health sector. I would like to know your comment on the announcement that at some point they agreed that centrally sponsored, there are too many centrally sponsored schemes, yet the budget was announced with a new centrally sponsored scheme for the health sector, which prioritizes spending in the primary, tertiary, and secondary healthcare institutions, which I think is kind of similar to the existing national health mission. So just wanted to know your opinion on was a separate centrally sponsored scheme really necessary at this point when we already have a flagship umbrella program? My second question was more broad, and it was about it's linking a lot of issues that you discussed here. It begins with direct benefit transfers. Do you think targeting income taxpayers, through direct benefit transfers and employment benefit and giving employment benefit incentives to smaller firms could have led to a larger multiplier effect? Because right now I feel that the budget is heavily relying on disinvestment revenue, and in the worst case scenario that we fail to achieve this, I don't think we are in a position where we can increase our tax revenues to a large extent. So do you think direct benefit transfer or any such a future announcement for income tax earners and small MSMEs can actually lead to a multiplier effect that could help us achieve I would call an optimistic fiscal target in next year as well as the year after? So I'll just limit my questions to these 2 points. Thanks.
Thanks, Pankaj. So I think again, I take a kind of dynamic view of revenue as well. So I think again, the best solution to all the problems the government has, especially if you're looking at more than a year medium term, is growth. I mean, if growth comes back strongly, then you don't have to worry about the revenue side. And to that extent, I think it's a good idea if the government was to consider at some point some incentives to maybe SMEs based on employment. As you said, if they create a certain number of employees, a certain number of formal employees, or something, anything to give a boost to jobs. And so I think, yeah, to the extent, and again, coming back to also what Professor Sarma said in terms of, the kind of protection or support the government should give, I think it should be less in terms of tariff and trade barriers, because and should be more in terms of the performance linked incentive is good because it depends on production. Now, if you have some other incentive you can link to job creation, that would also be good. So I think if you can come up with incentives which are WTO compliant, which can support SMEs, which can create employment, certainly I would do that. But anything to get growth going and employment going, because I think your tax revenue problem, even if it doesn't solve itself for the next financial year, I don't think it will solve itself. I don't think the disinvestment target of, I would seriously doubt if 1.75 lakh crores will be met unless they sell 3 blue chip PSUs, which again, I highly doubt will happen in 1 year. But I don't see any other way they're going to get 1.75 lakh crores in a year. But I wouldn't worry too much, even if it's not 6.8 the deficit, suppose it's 7.5, I don't think it's the end of the world. I would still not raise taxes and that kind of thing, not go for that approach. So I think anything to get growth going, any incentives to growth going are worth it, because I always say that government I wish there was no Department of Revenue in the finance ministry, because they function like we function in the corporate sector on targets and so on. Once you have a target, then you do anything that you can to get to that target. So if you have certain revenue targets, and whether it's increase in taxes or putting a cess, if you become revenue minded, there are lots of things you do, and there are cesses all over the place. They're here, there, everywhere, and I think ultimately those also need to be clean. So I think being revenue minded is not helpful. Just be growth minded and do whatever it takes for that. On the centrally sponsored schemes, yeah, totally. I wish there was no new scheme. In fact, I think that was we really don't need more schemes. I think again for health, and it certainly don't need centrally sponsored schemes because again, I know it's shared 60-40 and so on, but again, ultimately the policy is decided from Delhi, and I don't think again in sector like health, where again there are a lot of variations in. Look, I guess Kerala doesn't need the kind of intervention which Bihar would need, and similarly some other state may not need what Punjab may need what Tamil Nadu doesn't need. So I think the centrally sponsored schemes make very little sense for me, unless it's something like a vaccination program on COVID, which is not a scheme; it's a one-time spend. So I would have rather it's consolidated into some other scheme or some existing scheme, or just don't do it. Give it to the states or let the states handle certain aspects. I think on especially social sectors like education, health, government can do like it's done Ayushman Bharat insurance or vaccination or things. But I think some of the other schemes can be left to the states to decide. Certainly not bring in more centrally sponsored schemes. Because every 5-10 years we do this exercise to reduce centrally sponsored schemes, which is mostly by merging them, and then you create more. So there's no end to that. But I think overall, again, yeah, I think maybe in health also, I mean, there could have been an argument to spend more given the particular circumstance that we find ourselves in. And yeah, so I think, yeah, on your revenue expenditure point, that's the only thing I said was missing from the budget. I mean, if they'd just given a cash transfer, I think that would have done a much more to boost consumption and make GDP immediately. Whereas capital expenditure in the government system, it takes its own time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Sir, just related to this only, I also thought to bring in that, sir, how do you see the new institution of GST coming in? Because a lot of the GST also has committee, all the state ministers also there, and there also has been drift even in the pandemic. How do you see that? And also the issue of fiscal federalism, and now what the Finance Commission is also suggesting. How do you see this evolving over the years?
So I think GST will ultimately, the reason we've not got the dividend of the kind we should have from it is because it was, based more on political logic than economic logic, the way it was finally rolled out. And I don't necessarily blame the central government for that, because, otherwise we may not have had it at all. So sometimes you have to accept in a system like ours to accept second best. But I think as we go forward, the GST Council, I hope, again, same as logic as central government, don't get too caught up with the rates and raising rates and focusing, on trying to squeeze more. It's the same slice of cake mentality. We don't think about growth and which will come if you have a stable, relatively low GST environment, right? I think initially there was a revenue neutral rate of 12 or 14 or something which was suggested, but we went with this 5 rates. Actually, we should have only 2. We should have either 0 rate exempt or 12. In India, I know there'll be insistence for a 3rd rate for luxury, because you won't want a Mercedes taxed at the same rate as a regular thing. But I mean, the logic of GST is that it should be 1 tax. But okay, I mean, if you want to stretch it, 3 exempt, 12, and luxury, which has very few items like top end automobiles. But beyond that, I mean, if you try and do this 5 tax structure and keep moving things, that's what leads to rent seeking and inefficiency. Then the less discretion there is, and the lower the rate, that's when we'll again get growth, and then we can have enough revenue for the states and for center and everybody, right? Right now we're all fighting over what is a limited pool, and eventually I think you'll have to also bring oil and gas and
Petrol,
petrol and
Natural
tobacco and alcohol and all in. But I mean, right now I don't think it will happen, because the government's fisc is surviving on the taxes on petrol and diesel. I mean, they're more than 100%. So, but eventually, yeah. I mean, I think even if you cannot solve for the time being the problem of petroleum and alcohol and tobacco, because say that gives flexibility to states to impose their own taxes and some amount of independence. Okay, so let's give that argument, but at least fix the remaining. What's in the mainstream. I think again, this is a good time to do it, because again, nothing focuses India like a crisis, right? And when we have our backs to the wall. So let's clean it up, because if you want that growth dividend and the revenue dividend, you need to take a slightly longer view. If you're looking at fighting away your next year's target, which is why I'm glad in many ways they projected at least a 5-year target for fiscal deficit, where at least they're thinking slightly longer than the next 1 or 2 years. And I think that's very important. Now we can argue whether it should be 4.5 or 3.5 or 5.5, but whatever it is, at least they're gradually reducing it and keeping that fiscal autonomy. And I think GST also, if you rationalize it, you will not see, I think there's more fear that your overall revenues will fall. If the economy grows, and I suspect, after the structural reforms which have been done and post-COVID, I think our growth rate will be fairly good. So I don't think we should be revenue minded. Even GST Council, that's all I would suggest, that it should not be, it should not focus on rates as a means to get a particular target. Focus on rates as a means to get efficiency, and you will get your target as a byproduct.
Right. Thank you, sir. So now also for infra push, we have National Infrastructure Pipeline, that project our finance minister from last budget also. We also have many industrial corridor in UP, Karnataka, many places, many things are also coming. And because of the trade war also, our finance minister, but the pandemic struck, red carpet to all those investors, other things were also coming in. And we also have smart cities. But again, sir, what you highlighted, in terms of ease of doing business or instilling confidence and competitiveness in the market, has this budget been also bold? Because China and other countries are also focusing a lot to eliminate corruption. And as you are also suggesting that the focus on good governance led reforms. And sir, I'm mentioning this because as we all know, the situation of private investment and private participation has been the low. Sir, what do you see are the hindrances and how we can also eliminate them?
So corruption, I think, is a human condition. It's there in every society, in every country, different income levels. But I think what we can do to minimize it is to basically use maximum technology and to maximum technology, as little discretion as possible, which is why I said as few permissions that are needed, the better it is. Ultimately, as little interface between government officials and private individuals. I think that's, in the long run, I mean, I don't think you can have, there's no moral way to solve this corruption problem, because if it was, at least some countries would have cracked it. You have to have the right incentives and the right systems in place. But I wouldn't say it's corruption per se necessarily. If corruption per se deterred investment, then why did China get so much for all these years? Now they may be trying to clean up, but for all these years they've not had a particularly clean system. Korea, East Asian countries didn't have a particularly clean system. But it's the little things, it's where you get, it's the speed. It's not that approvals are not needed. Again, it's not that environment clearance is not needed. But if something can take 90 days and actually takes 850 days, environment forest clearance should be done in 4 months. Right, you say yes, no. You can say, I mean, if it's not possible, sorry, but you take 3 years, and for investors, time is money. So I think we don't recognize the importance of that speed. It's not about regulation. Regulation is there in every country; it should be there. But speed, transparency, self-certification. Now, for example, we don't have to get our certificates and all attested. Self-attestation works, so you can move towards more efficient systems, because the little things which bother investors is the things which don't come in budgets which bother investors. And to the extent that budget matters, yes, the overall, I mean, if there's less changes, the better. So if you've now reduced corporate taxes, which is why I was very happy. There was a temptation and there was a lot of pressure that they should raise taxes on corporates, put COVID cess, but once you've decided, last year only you decided, or I mean, to 2019 you decided to lower corporate tax rate and to make it competitive with East Asia, then now you stick with it. You stick with it for 10, 15 years, right? Because investors don't look at a 1 or 2 year horizon. They come investing with a 10, 20 year horizon in most sectors. So I think stability, predictability, sometimes in India, we do things retrospectively, change things retrospectively. Those kind of things really damage investor confidence. So I don't think it's necessarily, we have a big market. We have fairly good policies also in terms of FDI, fairly open policies in most sectors, but people don't come in the numbers. In my own sector now, I work in sort of mining, and so there are very few foreign investors, though 100% is allowed, because the process is so cumbersome. And they don't find it worth and there's so much uncertainty that first you get a mining lease, then 3 months later they'll say it's a no-go area. Now, if it's a no-go area, why did you give the mining lease? You should predefine that no factory, no mine can come up in this forest, right? There's no confusion. But if you give it then 6 months later, somebody has invested money, then you say, sorry, we're canceling it. Like, those are the kinds of things, administrative things, process related things, which cause investors problem, and frequent changes. I think in other countries, these things don't change like all the time, or speed is respected. I mean, like China, one of the great things, the two things they have, which we don't, is scale and speed. Otherwise, I'm not a great fan of the Chinese system and their practices and their transparency, but they do manage to do things at scale, and they do manage to do things at speed, which is what we need to do. So in our case, the bigger the project, the harder it is to actually get off the ground, because like you see with this, which a government project, this high-speed rail, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, land acquisition has not got done, right? So how will, and this is a government project. So if a private sector person sets up a big project, they would expect a certain amount of ease. One idea which has been doing the rounds, which should be pushed apart from self-certification, is that embedded clearances. So state government should only give a piece of land for, say, factory. Once all the clearance, they should obtain the necessary clearances and then give it out, rather than have the private investor running around trying to get clearances. A job of a private investor or job of a CEO is not to manage government, it's to run the business, right? So I think once you give that ecosystem, our managers and entrepreneurs are second to none. We are frankly running some of the biggest companies of the world now, whether it's Google or Microsoft, all being run by Indian educated. I mean, they've lived in the US, but they all grew up here, educated here. So we create the ecosystem, and we do have a good startup ecosystem, and that's come up in spaces where the government doesn't have so much interference, right? So I think if the government was to remove its interference from a number of sectors, then you will see things will come up. Services also, I believe, have come up in India because there's less interface. In manufacturing, there's a lot of approvals required, many approvals required, which take a lot of time and don't get done. That's another reason manufacturing hasn't taken off. And that will not be solved by just raising your protection. Because if you still don't get your approvals, what use is your tariff barrier?
Yes, sir. In fact, for our milk sector and others also, RCEP and so many things for efficiency also coming in terms of so many things. Sir, the point also you mentioned about technology. How do you see the automation, future of work? Budget also had something on gig workers also. China has something, industry IoT, Internet of Things, their manufacturing push. How do you see our Make in India or our job market, our economic market and technology going forward in this?
So I think, again, the future is best left to entrepreneurs. If the government tries to plan too much and make too many policies and too many regulations, it will not happen. So future has to be discovered by enterprise. I mean, there's no way I can tell you sitting here which will be the sectors of the future. I mean, we have some vague idea that robotics matters, 3D printing, 3D manufacturing, artificial intelligence, data. I think data is very important. I think that's often underestimated. And as you had earlier said, in India, we do have a fairly robust data system. So we should be able to leverage that. But I think, of course, the standard fear with what we're talking about is that jobs will be lost and what will happen and so on. My counter to that is that in the 1970s, if I was sitting, you and I were having a discussion, would we have ever discussed that the biggest job creator in India would be IT services? No. There are certain new sectors which get created, which create a whole set of jobs which we can't imagine until so some old jobs went, obviously, once IT came, but a whole lot of new jobs were created. Now, what we need is that we need the workforce, therefore, our population. Where we are lacking is not so much, what will happen in the future and our people, but we are lacking in skilling them, soft skills, flexibility, adaptability. That's what will be important, so that people have enough basic skills and basic soft skills, hard skills, whatever, all kinds of skills to adapt. And the government will then have to basically, any change that comes, whether it's a policy change or a technological change, will create some winners and some losers. That's inevitable. It happens. It's happened throughout history. We can't escape it. The thing is that the government must not stop the winners, and it must look after the losers. So there has to be, but again, to look after the losers, I think you need a bigger economy. You can't have a social security system of any significance with a 2.7 trillion economy in a 1.4 billion population country. We're still too low income. So I think the challenge is therefore to grow very rapidly, so that when these changes come, we are in a position to give benefits to those who may lose jobs, help them retrain, reskill, So all these things, I think, in a democracy like India, it will have to be managed. There's no, we can't pretend that it's not going to happen. And I think even now, some of the changes which need to be done, I think the government needs to manage very proactively the losers, or the people who fear they'll lose. They may not even lose in the end, but the people who fear loss from a particular change, they have to be given the assurances, and they have to be shown, that they have alternatives. Because without that, it's very difficult to do change. Because then, the moment a small but noisy section believes they're going to lose out, they will not let you push the change. We're seeing that to some extent in the farm laws. Of course, it's a complex issue, and don't want to get into a discussion on that. But you can see any big change will have resistance. So you have to manage that resistance. In the farm laws, of course, the government has brought the change. When technological change comes, even the government will not be able to do anything about it. And India isn't to stop it. It will come. It will be a fact of life.
Yes, sir. In fact, the Chinese company Zhenzhua Data also snooped all Indian, our all minister and everything. Also, those things also coming. Atul sir, would you like to chip in and ask or discuss some of the things on some monetary or fiscal part? Atul sir, you are on mute. If you can unmute, yes.
Yeah, one or 2 points I'd like to raise. One is that I still see that there is in the budget, there is fiscal consolidation approach. Because it was from RE, it was from 60.8. No, 9.5%, it was reduced to 6.8. And then 4.8. So there is an attempt to go for fiscal consolidation. It's a kind of conservatism that still remains in the context where we have to provide the short-term, address the issue of short-term demand efficiency. The other point that was said that, when you focusing on manufacturing, was it not necessary to attempt at two things? One is the go for judicial reforms, which you could not a budget, the budget matter, but the judicial reform is extremely important. And secondly, the ease of doing business, where we have improved the ranking, but the quality of ease of doing should have been much better. It should have been towards the reduction of the transaction cost, and that focus could have been done in the budget itself. And third point I would made of that when we are focusing on the manufacturing growth, it is important to also focus on R&D. Eventually, R&D is important to have improve the competitive ability. And finally, the cost of transaction, logistic cost, as you have rightly put, that high cost economy, it is a high cost economy. We need to attack them. There should have been a judicious ways to attack the high cost economy. Of course, interest rate is also very high, but that is a different issue which budget cannot do. But some of the things which could have been attempted to reduce the cost of transaction cost. That's all. I'd like to get your response.
Thank you. Dheeraj sir, would you like to?
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, judicial reforms is again a very important part of the piece, because for contract enforcement, investor confidence, again, there's no speed in the judiciary, and it takes years and years to get any resolution. So I think that certainly is a matter which needs priority, but obviously not a budget bat. I completely take the point about the short term. So I think that the bet is something different on the budget. We have to see, whether it works or not. But and what the second question was, sir?
R&D.
R&D. I think again, yeah, we spend very, very little. So I think there is some kind of allocation this year. But again, I think it's over 5 years or something for this National Research Development Fund. But I think, again, if you're talking about, and you mentioned the fourth industrial revolution earlier, and for that matter, in any technology, I think whichever countries have succeeded, whether it's the US or Europe or Russia or wherever, there's a combination of government R&D and R&D spending and private R&D spending, which we just don't have anywhere near the scale. So again, overall, again, I would like to say one thing, that again, we are seeing privatization in the context of privatization of PSUs and, you know, revenue and whatever else efficiency. But I think the larger point, which still remains to be resolved in India, is that what is the government supposed to do? I mean, should the government really be running companies, or should it be, you know, spending on R&D? I mean, should we be spending 10,000 crores a year on Air India and another 5,000 on BSNL, and the list goes on? Or should it be spending that money instead on R&D or health or education? So I think the government also slowly, and I hope that there is clarity in terms of what it should do. And I think, again, I would take this to a second level, that R&D is something the central government will have to do. It's unlikely the state governments will do that. So I think, again, I would certainly like to see this budget. They made, as I said, some allocation, but it's nothing. I mean, it's nothing in the kind of research that needed. So if we want to be leaders or anywhere close to the leaders when this next big change comes, we need to spend a lot more on it. So I would, again, it's a matter of prioritization. So, I would like to see expenditure switching over the years towards this kind of thing, rather than some of the other schemes that we are running. And of course, but it can't be government alone. It will have to be, obviously, in cooperation with the private sector, because I think government capacity is, again, limited. But the private sector also, in fairness, private sector also does not spend that much on R&D in India. So you need a much better ecosystem, especially if you're talking about a high-tech, future. So right now, the only thing, like even in the startup system, the innovation we are having is basically we are copying largely some designs which somebody else developed first. So I think you're getting that ability, which is not a bad ability to have. I mean, it's something, but I think to move to the next level, you need a lot more, even in something like vaccines or health, you need a lot more money to move to the next level. And I think if we don't move to that next level, then again, we'll be playing catch up for a long time. So yeah, R&D, I think, in fact, I was earlier thinking of putting it as part of my points, but then I thought they haven't really done significant enough for it. So, but I hope somehow, again, certain ministries like Department of Science and Technology, I think should be one of the most important departments in the government, but somehow it's treated as one of the less important, less glamorous. But that's the future. The future is all over there, not in the old, not in the steel ministry, not in the heavy industry ministry. It's actually all in science and technology.
Yes. One more concern I'd like to share with you, that about the human development, actually expenditure has gone down in this budget. When as the demographers say, the demographic transition has already started in India, but luckily, however, it is India can enjoy demographic dividend for a little longer period. It has started it seems to have started from 2018, and it is expected to continue up to 2050. In this, if we want to really enjoy the humanity, demographic dividend, it's important to invest on the social sectors. And there's it is a matter of concern that allocation on education has gone down, even though they have started some schools and some institutions.
Kendriya Vidyalaya, yes.
Yeah, Kendriya Vidyalaya.
100.
It's gone down in total. This is a matter of great concern, actually. Because unless you invest heavily on the human development, that is, we will not be able to enjoy any demographic dividend. It will be a disaster kind of thing.
No, correct. Absolutely correct point. The only thing I would say is that in education, it's not only the resources which are a problem. And education, despite having done a fairly good job in the last 25 years of the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan and 100% enrollment, at least in primary level, you still have very poor learning outcomes. Class 5 kids can't do class 2 problems, and we know those are well documented. So I think the entire system needs a relook, not just in terms of how much money is being allocated to it, but what actually are the outcomes coming out of the system. Are we actually just putting people into school, but they have no learning, so they have no skills and they have no employability. So I think it's while I agree that resources are required, I think again, the delivery and what is coming out of the system also needs to be rethought. Perhaps again, best rethought at a state level than consolidated national level. But national, since Arjun mentioned Kendriya Vidyalayas or something, I mean, you could use certain national institutions to experiment a little with, or to figure out how to get better outcomes. I think some of the hypocrisies we have in education also can end. Like this not allowing for profit, for example. So you have all kinds of fly-by-night entrepreneurs running allegedly not for profit education institutions which are low quality, high prices, both schools and higher education. Whereas in effect, education is already privatized because most 60% of Indian children go to private school, even if it's under a tree or whatever it is. So I think some of that, because I think again, we look at profit very negatively in India, but again, there can be clever entrepreneurs who will come up with a business model at scale to provide quality education at low prices, competition. I think, we need to allow a whole variety of things if you have to lift it. I think the government alone is not going to be able to lift the whole thing. So I think we need a serious rethink on many aspects of education, because I agree with you, sir, that both in terms of allocation and in terms of the other thing, this is where we are going to miss the bus really, because there'll be no dividend if we don't get this act together. And whatever fourth industrial revolution, fifth industrial revolution, if you don't have an educated population, you'll already, I can see, like in industry, there are so many jobs for which you have to, get people now from outside because we don't have the skills for skilled jobs. Not for unskilled jobs, but for skilled jobs. So I think, and that's a peculiar situation in a labor abundant country if companies are struggling to find, skilled people and are having to look to China or, South Africa or wherever else in the world to get those people. I think that tells you something. So between education and skills, I think, we haven't really, I think in health, there's still been some amount of thinking with Ayushman Bharat and, some of the schemes. Again, that also has a long way to go. But I think in education, we're still trudging along the same route, perhaps with less allocation, as you're saying. But I don't think we are rethinking where we want to be there. I think, again, perhaps not in a budget, but somewhere there needs to be a much greater thrust on this sector.
Higher allocation is a necessary condition. It is not sufficient. Certainly.
No, I agree.
Way back in 1968, Kothari Commission recommended 6.8%, but we are now we are having only around 4%.
4.5, yes. Shashi Tharoor, sir, also it's been, but also including the private. But sir, I really wanted to touch upon Atul sir, what really raised the point of judicial. Because time and again, and we have NGT and others. And when we see our service economy, be it construction, now we have something called RERA, then in insurance, in telecom, hospitality, everywhere, sir, a regulatory authority, in telecom also now independent. And this has been also, how do you see this conundrum also coming upon in each of our, how are we maturing in our service economy also? Is it also leading to the animal spirit, or how the role of government also in regulation is, how do you see that? Because
let me present one fact before services. I think in India, we often accept that our manufacturing is poor, and then, as a corollary, we say that, we are very good at services. We're better than China. But actually, if you look at our share of global services, trade in global services, it's better than manufacturing. It's a little over 3%. But China's is more than ours. It's 4% or so, right? It's still much less than their manufacturing. So comparatively, they are much stronger there. But our services also, what have done well, a few services. IT did well, IT services, telecom did well, and aviation did reasonably well. Now all of them are reaching a point where there's a saturation. IT needs to do something different. Telecom is in a mess. Aviation, of course, because of pandemic, but hopefully it'll recover. But whatever. So these were the things. But education, health are also services, right? And it's not only about producing for our own people. For example, in higher education, why can't we? Create institutions where people from outside India, other parts of Asia, neighboring countries come and pay and study. Similarly, in healthcare, we have a very small medical tourism thing. But these are also healthcare, and these can be job generators also. And you think about healthcare, the kind of healthcare we need, or the aging population now, there'll be an entirely new category of geriatric care. You'll need nurses, caretakers. So these can actually be huge sectors for the future, the next generation of services. I think, again, to the extent that telecom and some of the earlier services got independent regulators and less control from ministries, they did well by it. Though again, we can have a whole session on whether the regulators have worked or not. But like for SEBI, stock market, SEBI was there. There are problems, but a lot of progress happened. So I think, again, if these sectors were to just be freed from ministerial control, and if you had regulation, because obviously you need in both education, health standards, safety, all these things matter, protection of consumers, that can never be sacrificed. But I think there's just so much potential in other services which we haven't. Tourism is, of course, the other one. It's so underutilized in India, and again, it's related to many things. But there's an entire line of services, or financial sector for that matter. Which bank of ours is even regionally competitive? Forget international, globally, right? But why can't we create a world-class bank or a bank which can, go outside? So I think there's an entire, and particularly for some reason, if we can't get manufacturing going because we cannot, for whatever reason, get our reforms done, then we have to, look at the next line of services, which are much more than IT, telecom, and aviation.
Yeah, exactly.
Which can, give us both foreign exchange and GDP growth and jobs. So I think we're not looking at these. We're still looking at these in terms of human development, which is, of course, very important. That's the core. But these can also be, opportunities in terms of growth and
Yes, so banks and monetary policy, it will require another lecture itself. But lastly, and then Pankhuri ma'am also have one question, international one. Sir, how do you see we should now raise our resources also? Because many people are suggesting COVID bonds, Europe is doing, US is doing green bonds on green infrastructure. They're also giving ads in Indian newspaper also now. And InvITs and REITs, so many innovation, also these things also coming, municipal bonds, other thing. How do you see, sir, we are going forward? Do we really need to leverage some of the pension funds from Canada or other places, or will we really be inclined more towards Japan for funding our some of the infrastructure? How do you see what should be the path ahead for our this financial requirements?
Again, let me say that there has never been a time when there has been so much liquidity in the world at such cheap rates. The world is just flush, and right now, it's going into stock markets, it's going into commodities, it's going into especially assets, and it may create, probably already creating asset bubbles there. So there's a lot of money which is looking for avenues, at least globally. So I think it's a call we have to take, but I still think overall, if you look at the debt in India, we are not really over leveraged. China is 4 times, 5 times more leveraged than us, and particularly a government debt, I would not favor necessarily going overboard, but private sector is not at all in the global scheme of things. Though we have over leveraged companies in some sectors and so on, but otherwise we are not at all over leveraged in terms of our households, and private sector actually not. So that is a huge avenue for growth. And as I said, there's money there, but you have to get the ecosystem right to get the money, right? People have to see that it's going into something productive, which will generate returns. So yeah, if you want to do something serious on green energy or clean energy or green hydrogen or whatever you want, I'm sure the money will come. I don't think there's plenty of money looking for a return. But if we see money is looking for return, it's not going to come in charity. It's not going to come free, but it's fairly cheap. Globally, it's never been cheaper. And I think there is definitely, if you look at China, up to 2010, it was definitely very much an export-led growth. But after 2010, China's growth, while there have been exports, a lot of it has come from internal sources and from leverage, from raising debt. So I think that is certainly an opportunity, but we need to again be smart about getting it here. And everybody is interested. Everybody is looking at India as well, because there are not that many economies in the world which have the potential or which have the population or which have the growth rate. Even at our mediocre, we are still 5-6%, which is not bad. So I think the opportunity is there. We need to design, whatever bonds or whatever we want, or private sector has to get into the right kinds of things. And I think there's no shortage of money. That's why I don't believe there's any. And at this particular point in time, it's just flush with liquidity, including in India.
And so some of our cities, for example, Ranchi, or many of our small cities also have potential of 20%, 25% year-on-year growth also. Because those small states also have these urban places, but the growth rate is really very high. We really have this potential, but we have been talking about this for so very long. We'll take one last question from Pankhuri ma'am, which Dheeraj sir can answer, and then Atul sir, you can have a crisp concluding remarks so that we can wrap. Pankhuri ma'am, over to you. Are you there?
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Kumar. Dheeraj, one question. I'm going back to trade. So just wanted to know your comment on RCEP and strategic partnerships. So when I look at China, they did invest heavily in their R&D, the government, and then right now they are actually revamping the chemical sector to ensure that they're EU compliant, so that their trade after a few number of years, I think they are taking a hit of 2.5% on their GDP just because of the chemical sector, in order to ensure that they have future trade relationships that are EU compliant with EU. So do you think RCEP could have been a precedent for us to negotiate better with US and EU? And do you think we still have time to kind of ramp up our sectors like pharma and chemicals, which actually, we have revealed comparative advantage in? Just wanted to know your views on that. Thank you.
So I was hired in NITI Aayog by Professor Arvind Panagriya. So if I say anything against free trade, he'd be very upset. But I think even he's come around to the view that staying out of RCEP was the right thing. And I think it was the right thing for only one reason, because the elephant in the room in RCEP, and I, as an industry person, I sat in several consultations and through industry chambers and so on with the Commerce Ministry. And the elephant in the room was China. I don't think anybody really had too many issues with, because ASEAN, as I said, we already have FTA, Japan, Korea also we have. Australia, New Zealand, there were certain issues on the dairy side. But otherwise, every industry across the board, their problem was China. And that, it's very, very difficult to compete with China in any case, but also the fact that the Chinese do give a lot of hidden subsidies and all kinds of hidden support which they don't declare. So you can't even, take action against them on those things. So I think in the end, it was really RCEP came down to whether we want a FTA with China. I think subsequently with all the trouble China is causing us, I think it was and then COVID as well, and the way the world has responded to that, I think may not necessarily be bad to have not joined it, as long as the government is not viewing this as a relief point to not do any reform to make us cost competitive, because that reality is not changed. So we didn't join RCEP. Maybe if we had joined, we would have been forced, because the one argument is, which is not an unreasonable argument, that whenever you join these FTAs, there's a long transition period. So it's not like you'll have zero duty from China the next day. It takes 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, depending on the good. So maybe if we had joined, it would have forced us, which was the argument people used when we joined WTO also, that will force us to clean up our act, but we didn't. So if we had joined RCEP and didn't clean up our act, we would have been finished. But if we don't join and we haven't joined and don't clean up our act, we'll be equally badly off. So I think strategically, in terms of the China factor, I support it that we didn't join it. But if it is used as fait accompli to not do the kind of reforms that are needed to make us structurally competitive, then it will not have served us well. But I still think there are other FTAs we can continue to explore, including with EU. But ultimately, we will not succeed. FTAs will not help us change our story. We have to change it ourselves. It's all homework. Those can be a kind of, because we haven't been able to take advantage, because the questions which Commerce Ministry used to keep asking in RCEP were, all of you are worried, all of industry is worried about imports. What about exports? But we are not in a position to, there are very few industries in a position to take advantage of that market access, because we are not competitive enough vis-a-vis China or the other countries. So until we are competitive there, we'll never be confident about FTAs.
Okay.
Thank you.
Then,
Atul sir, yes, please, over to you.
yeah. I don't know. I must compliment Dheeraj, because he has given a very balanced and perceptive talk. There are many takeaways from his talk, and very realistic views that he has expressed, and I thank him for that. I think all of us have enjoyed the presentation that he has made, and we have learned a lot of things. I'd like to thank him, compliment him for the 30% he has made. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dheeraj sir, any parting words or way forward lines from you?
No, so I'm there. I mean, like I said, there's a difference in our political economy of slice of cake and size of cake. We also have two kinds of people who two kinds of views on India: the glass half full, glass half empty. So I'm on the optimist side. I still think the potential is huge, as you said, everywhere. And I've traveled around India as a media person, as a journalist in corporate, and everywhere I go, I only see potential. And it's a matter of getting a few things right to realize that potential. And I'll be very sad if we don't, because I think we've come a fair distance, of course. But in 1991, I often show this chart. The per capita income of India was $363 and China was $359 in 91. The year we began a reform, we had slightly more per capita. They had a higher GDP because the population was larger. And in that much time, we've come from $360 to $2,000 per capita, 6 times, which is good. But China has gone from $350 to $10,000 per capita, 35 times. And it's not only China. Earlier, you've seen South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, many countries, Taiwan, have done transformational change in one generation. So for me, I'm pretty confident we'll get to $5 trillion and $10 trillion at some point. But I would like to see us get there in a generation, change this country in 20, 25 years. And for that, you need, at least 10% growth, because that size of cake has to improve to get some of the other things right. So I would only urge that the potential is there. You should just focus on speed, scale, and growth for two and a half decades, and that will what will really change the face of this country, rather than I agree welfare is important, but if you put welfare first, then it's unlikely that we'll get to where we want in a hurry. But nonetheless, I remain fairly optimistic on India. Sorry, and the last thing I'd say is that we should also realize that it's not the government which will transform this country. It's entrepreneurs will transform the country. Ultimately, the jobs have to come from the private sector. Government is not going to create jobs. Government job is, of course, to facilitate. And if it gets into that mode in earnest, there's a long legacy of control and regulation and over-regulation, which will take time to erase itself. But as the younger generation and most of India, 2/3 is under 35. I think we are shedding some of our old fears and taking some bold steps. So I hope that will only speed up. And with an entirely new class of entrepreneurs which is coming up, I hope they'll also be better role models, because some of the earlier entrepreneurs were not always the best models. There was accusations of crony capitalism and so on. But I think that will also change. So I think things are changing. They may be slower than we like. So what I would like to see is our potential converted into reality at a much faster speed.
Thank you.
We part with a note of optimism.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Dheeraj. Thank you.
Yes. So let me just formally propose this vote of thanks for this very special lecture on Budget 2021 and Economic Reforms 2.0 towards New India, #Atmanirbhar Bharat. And really thankful to our speaker, Dr. Dheeraj sir, for giving this very insightful, and I would say this is very serene conversation on this very hot topic. And thank you, Professor Atul Sharma sir, for chairing this session and really conducting. I learned a lot, and thank you, Pankhuri ma'am, also for chipping in and asking this very pertinent question and discussing on these issues. With that, I wish you all.
I'll just say one thing before you end,
Please.
because that I
Please.
just saw on your screen the word Atmanirbhar, and I think this is going to be a very important term going forward. As long as this does not mean protectionism, as long as this means making ourselves competitive, I think that's the key. Be super competitive economy. If that is the meaning of Atmanirbhar, that we can rely on ourselves to be competitive, then we'll succeed.
That's my problem. Atmanirbhar, too much focus on Atmanirbhar and talking about high growth is a problem for me.
Yeah, so I think we have to be very careful with this
Yeah.
word, what it means, and where it leads us in terms of policies. Because no country, again, sorry to again speak after I said I won't, but no country in the world has prospered in isolation. It always, to some extent, you have to have engagement with the other countries and global community. The terms of engagement, of course, are for you to define and for you to leverage. But I think we need to be careful with this word. And to the extent that these webinars, seminars, talks, all of us need to keep emphasizing the point that Atmanirbhar doesn't mean closing up and going back to what we were before. It should mean that we are self-confident and competitive to take on the world.
Yes, in fact, our Prime Minister now in all the speeches also saying that from Atmanirbhar to Atmavishwas.
Yeah.
Just to clarify this also. Thank you everyone. Thank you, Dheeraj sir, once again, and Atul sir and Pankhuri ma'am. And we look forward to learning more from you in the future. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Arjun. Thank you, Professor Sharma. Thank you, Pankhuri.
Thank you. Thank you. Wish you all the best.
Yes. Have a good night.